Lena is holding my face in both hands. The city is behind me through the window wall, doing nothing useful. Her thumbs are at my cheekbones. 2 points of pressure, specific and steady. And she is looking at me the way she has looked at the Coastal Civic building on my wall for 11 months, which is to say with the total attention of someone who has just confirmed what she already knew. My hands have come up to cover hers without my permission. That is the complete version of staying. If you want to hear uncensored too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe. 11 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in February, I was arguing with a load-bearing calculation that was technically correct and aesthetically unforgivable when the floor changed. That is the only way to describe it. I was at my desk with a red pen and a structural report and a cup of coffee that had been cold for 40 minutes, and then the floor changed. Not the temperature, that came later. The room's attention. Conversations 2 desks over simply stopped mid-sentence, as if their speakers had noticed something more important. Someone in the corridor said something that trailed off without finishing. I looked up from the report because my body understood before my mind did that something had entered the space that demanded accounting. She was at the end of the corridor with the managing partner's administrative liaison, and she was not moving quickly. That was the first thing. She moved at the pace of someone who has never needed to demonstrate that she was in a hurry, because the schedule rearranges itself around her rather than the reverse. Dark blazer, slim trousers, jet black hair in the professional clip she would wear for the next 11 months. She was taller than I had registered from the announcement photo, lean in a way that suggested density rather than absence, the architecture of someone built for endurance rather than impression. The administrative liaison was speaking. She was not listening the way people listen when they're being polite. She was listening the way she would turn out to read everything in this building, with the specific gravity of someone mapping terrain. Her eyes moved along the corridor walls as she walked, cataloging. They passed over the project photographs mounted outside the senior associates' offices. They paused at mine, not at me, at the photograph of the Coastal Civic building, which is the largest one in the corridor outside my office and is, technically, the most significant built work in the firm's current portfolio. Her gaze was there for perhaps 2 seconds. Then it moved on, and she was past my doorway, and the corridor's conversations restarted as if someone had lifted a hand from a volume dial, and I looked back at my structural report and wrote the correct load distribution with the red pen and did not think about it. That was the lie I told myself on day 1. Her first week, she requested individual sessions with each senior associate. 30 minutes, structured, 3 questions each, documented. The questions, when I read them on the scheduling note, were exactly right. Not politically right, structurally right. The kind of questions that demonstrated she had already read every project file in the system before she arrived, and was using the sessions not to gather information she didn't have, but to cross-reference against information she did. It was, professionally speaking, the most annoying possible approach, because it meant the sessions were not performative and required real answers. My session was on a Thursday afternoon, 2nd week of February. I had prepared 3 answers that were professionally complete and gave away nothing I wasn't comfortable giving. I sat across the desk from her in the managing partner's office, which still smelled like the previous partner's coffee and was already in the process of being reorganized in a way that suggested she had very specific ideas about sightlines. And she asked the first question. It was about the Coastal Civic building, not the built result, the decision sequence. The specific structural compromise I'd made at the foundation level that you would only know about if you had read the construction documentation and the original design intent and understood the gap between them. She asked it in the flat, precise language of someone describing a known fact, not a question she was genuinely uncertain about. I answered it honestly, which was not what I had planned. The second question was about the residential mixed-use project currently on my desk, which was at that point in month 7 of a planned 18-month design phase. And she asked about the structural spine, specifically about the decision I'd made at the upper-level transition zone that was in the design documents but not in the presentation materials, which meant she had read the design documents and not just the presentation materials. I answered that one honestly, too. The third question she did not ask. She looked at the project photograph mounted on the wall of the managing partner's office, a photograph of the Coastal Civic building, which was already there when she arrived and which she had not moved, and she said, "That's it!" Meaning the session was complete, meaning she had what she needed. She thanked me in the formal register she used for everything in those early weeks, and I stood up and I walked back to my office, and I sat down at my desk and looked at my cold coffee and understood that I was going to have to be very careful for the foreseeable future. The restructure plan arrived in formal documentation 6 weeks later. It was objectively correct. The senior associate tier had grown without structural logic, roles overlapping, decision chains tangled, project ownership diffuse in ways that slowed everything downstream. Her restructure addressed every one of those problems with the precision of someone who had read the firm's project archive and identified not the symptoms, but the underlying condition. It was also the kind of thing that, if you had been in this firm for 11 years and had watched the tier grow organically and understood why it had grown the way it had, you would look at and feel the particular irritation of being thoroughly understood by someone you hadn't asked. I read it twice. I made 2 notes in the margin, both technical, both relevant. I filed it. I did not say what I thought about it, because what I thought about it was not a professional position, and I was, for the duration of this restructure, operating in professional positions only. That was month 2. Month 2 was also when I noticed the site model. The site model for the residential mixed-use project lives on the credenza beside my desk. It is a physical, 3-dimensional working model, balsa and basswood, and structural wire, at 1:200 scale, representing the current design state of my most significant ongoing project. It is a working object, not a display piece. It gets modified. It accumulates pencil marks and small adhesive flags when I am testing decisions. Lena came to my office for the first time in the 2nd month. A project check-in, routine, the kind she was running with each senior associate on a rotating basis. She sat across the desk from me and we covered the agenda items in order, and at the end of the check-in, she stood up, and on her way to the door, she stopped at the credenza. She put one hand on the structural spine of the model, the central load-bearing axis that runs the building's full length, and she held it there for perhaps 4 seconds, looking at the upper-level transition zone I'd been working on that week. She didn't ask. She didn't comment. She just held the model there, with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything in this building, and then she moved her hand and said goodbye, and left. I sat at my desk and looked at the site model for a moment. I had not told her to stop. That was a fact I noted and filed incorrectly, under professional norms, and moved on. The 3rd month, she came back for another check-in, and she touched the model again, this time at the lower-level foundation zone, a different hand position, as if she had been thinking about a specific question since the last visit. Still no comment, still no request for permission. I watched her do it from behind the formality of my project report and said nothing, which was a choice I was making consciously by now, though I was still filing it under something other than what it was. Month 4, the review cycle. She came to observe the senior associate's presentation session. Routine, documented. She sat at the back of the room with a notebook, and she did not write in it. I presented the residential mixed-use project at the mid-design stage. I was precise and complete, and I did not look at her during the presentation, which was a discipline I had been practicing since February. I looked at the drawings. I looked at the room. I did not look at her. At the end of the session, she said one thing. It was about the structural spine of the residential project, a question about the decision logic at the upper-level transition zone, phrased in the same flat, precise language as the session in February, the language of someone referencing a known position and checking for movement. I answered it, and when I finished the answer, she looked at me. Not at the drawing, not at the room, at me, and her gaze went to my collarbone for 2 seconds. Not a sweep, not a scan. 2 seconds, specific and contained, and then it was gone, and she thanked me and the session ended. I drove home that evening in the specific silence of someone managing something carefully. I did not revisit it. I filed it in the category marked Irrelevant Professional Observations and left it there for the next 7 months, where it stayed with perfect discipline and approximately 0 actual effect on my nervous system every time she walked into my office and touched the site model without asking. By month 7, the model had evolved significantly. The upper-level transition zone decision had been revised twice. The foundation approach had changed once. She had touched the model at every visit, 12 visits across 7 months. Always a different location, always the current area of active design development, which meant she was tracking the project between visits in enough detail to know where to put her hand when she arrived. She was reading the design documents. She was reading them with enough attention to follow the project's development in real time. I knew this by month 7. I had known it, if I was being honest with myself, by month 4. I had simply been allocating that knowledge to a category that kept it at professional distance, which was the correct allocation and was costing me more per month than I had originally budgeted. The year-end review was scheduled for 3 weeks before year-end, in the standard format, Individual sessions with each senior associate, final agenda, the restructure confirmation document to be signed. My session was at 8 p.m. I dressed for it with the same consideration I had brought to every professional interaction with Lena for 11 months. The burgundy blouse, the dark trousers, the jacket over the chair. Professional. Correct, at no point interpretable. The review itself was, technically, everything a year-end review should be. She covered every agenda item in order, efficiently, in the formal register she had used for 11 months. The restructure confirmation document was the second to last item. She read the relevant section aloud. My role in the new structure, defined, documented, effective in the new year. She signed it. The pen stayed on the paper for 3 seconds after the signature, which was not a standard thing for Lena to do with a pen, and which I noted with the specific alertness of someone who has been watching someone else's hands for 11 months. Then she slid the document across the desk to me. Last item, she said, one more thing, not in the document, and closed the review folder. I looked at her across the desk. She said, the residential project, the transition zone decision you revised in month 9. The first version was structurally correct. The revision is architecturally correct. You didn't document why you changed it. I said, no, she said. I'd like to know, I said. It's in the design drawings, she said. I know. I'd like you to tell me. The distinction she was making was not a small one, and I registered it in a place in my chest that was not where professional registrations belonged. I told her in the plain language of someone describing a structural decision, which is the most honest language I have for anything, and she listened with the full attention she had always brought to everything in this building, and at the end, she said thank you in a register that was almost but not quite the formal one. Then she signed the document, my signature was second, and gathered her materials and said goodnight and left. That was 9:50 p.m. I sat at my desk and looked at the signed review document and the site model on the credenza and the built project drawings on the 3 walls of my office. 11 years of work at large format print scale surrounding the desk where I had spent approximately 4,000 hours of my professional life. And I thought about Lena's pen staying on the signature for 3 seconds and about the question that was not in the document. I thought about month 4. I thought about 12 visits and 12 contacts with the site model. I thought about the transition zone decision I hadn't documented and had just told her about in full. I put the review document to one side. I got out the current design iteration for the residential project. I started working. I did not attribute this to anything I wasn't ready to name. At 10:04 p.m., Lena was in my doorway. She still had the blazer on. Her hair was down, the professional clip gone, the jet black length of it loose at her shoulders, which was the first time in 11 months I had seen it that way, in which my peripheral vision registered with the specific alertness of a system encountering new data. She was standing in the doorway, and the desk lamp was the only light on the floor, and the corridor behind her was dark. She said, "You stayed." I said, "I had work." She walked across the office. She did not come to the desk. She went to the wall, the south wall, where the built project drawings hang at large format scale, the full 11-year record of my time in this firm. She stopped in front of the Coastal Civic Building, the largest drawing, the one she had looked at from the corridor on her first day, and she stood there with her hands at her sides looking at it. I watched her from the desk. The floor was quiet in the way it is quiet only after 10 p.m. The climate system, the building settling, the particular quality of an empty building's silence that registers differently against the body than occupied silence. The city moved through the window opposite, doing the ambient work. The lamp was warm on my left arm where I had turned in the chair to face the wall. She said to the drawing, "I've been reading these for 11 months. My jaw did something it had no professional business doing. She turned, she looked at me across the desk lamp. Her face in the lamp's directional warmth was precise and angular, and the professional register was almost there, but there was something underneath it tonight that had been almost there for a long time and was closer to the surface than it had ever been in 11 months of professional interactions. She said, "Why haven't you asked me what I think?" The question landed in my chest before it arrived in my mind. I had thought about it, not in those terms, not in that form, but the substance of it had occupied a category in my thinking since approximately month 3. And I had been declining to name it in those terms, because naming it in those terms would have required naming other things consecutively. I said, "Would it have changed anything?" She held the look for 3 seconds. Then she crossed to the desk, not to sit, not to retrieve anything, and she put her hand on the desk's edge, the back of her fingers along the wood, slow, moving in my direction, specific, deliberate in the way she was deliberate about everything. Her fingers did not reach mine because I was still holding my pen and had not set it down, which was a form of staying in position that I was choosing consciously and which she appeared to register, because she stopped her hand where it was and did not close the remaining distance. She said, "No," she said. "It wouldn't have changed anything." She said, "The Coastal Civic Building is the best work I've seen in 11 years in this field. The decision sequence at the foundation, the compromise you made between structural necessity and the site's tidal risk. I've been looking at that drawing for 11 months because I keep finding something new in it." I set the pen down. She said, "You didn't ask." I said, "No." She said, "Why?" There were several honest answers to that question. I chose the simplest one. I said, "Because the answer would have cost me something I wasn't ready to spend." She looked at me for a long moment. The lamp was the only warm thing in the room. Her hand was still on the desk's edge, the back of her fingers against the wood, and in the empty floor's silence, I could hear the specific quality of her breath. Controlled, precise, the same discipline she applied to everything, but with a quality of effort in it tonight that had not been there at 9 p.m. Then she crossed to the south wall. She stood in front of the Coastal Civic Building, drawing again, facing it, and she began to describe it. Not to me, or not only to me, to the drawing. She named the construction material, the structural logic at the base, the site orientation, and the reason for it. She named the foundation compromise and why it was the only viable solution, given the tidal risk and the brief's requirements. She named the load distribution at the roof level. She named the decision I had agonized over longest, the fenestration pattern on the east elevation, which was not a structural decision but an architectural one, and which was the most personal decision in the entire project. And she described it in the flat, precise language of someone who had not read it off the drawing but had been carrying it in memory. She had been reading these for 11 months. She knew them the way she knew the review document. She knew them the way she had known the question about the foundation compromise on day 1 of my session in February, which was to say, completely. Her voice in the empty floor at 10 p.m. was lower than it was in meetings. Not lower by performance, lower because the professional register requires a particular expenditure of energy, and at 10 p.m., in an empty building with one desk lamp and no agenda, she was not spending it. The flat, precise language remained. The acoustic effect of that voice in the empty room was not something I had previously tested my discipline against, because previously there had been other people present, and other people present are a form of structural support. I was sitting at my desk with no structural support, and her voice was describing my best work from memory, and the lamp was warm on my left arm, and the site model was on the credenza between us. I watched her from the desk, and I did not move, and my breathing was doing something I was managing. She stepped back from the drawing. Her hand went to the site model on the credenza, not looking, reaching, the motion of someone whose body had memorized the position of the object across 12 visits. She touched the structural spine, the same position as the first visit. First contact, in month 2, right hand, the central load-bearing axis. Her fingers were still for a moment. She said quietly, as if to the drawing, "This is the best work I've seen in 11 months. She meant the firm. The Coastal Civic Building is the best work the firm has produced in its recent history, and she was measuring it against the firm. I knew she meant the firm. I also knew she did not only mean the firm, and that knowing that cost me exactly what I had not been ready to spend in month 3. I stood up from the desk. It was not a considered decision. My body made it before the consideration arrived. I crossed the office. I stood beside her. Not opposite, beside, both of us, facing the Coastal Civic Building at the same angle. Perhaps 30 centimeters between us. The lamp was behind us now. The city through the window opposite provided the ambient light, gray-dark and diffuse. The large format print's surface was in front of both of us, matte and slightly cool in the room's air. She did not turn. I said, "You touch the site model every time you were in this office." A pause, specific, long enough to register. She said, "Yes." I said, "I watched you." She turned then. Not toward me, toward the wall, adjusting her angle to face more directly at the Coastal Civic drawing. But in turning, her forearm came alongside mine, the dark silk of the nursing bralettes' inner edge against my burgundy sleeve, her arm warm and slightly present against my arm in the particular way that proximity registers when you have been maintaining professional distance from a person for 11 months and the distance closes by 3 centimeters without announcement. She said, "Show me which decision you'd change." I raised my hand and pointed to the fenestration pattern on the east elevation. The most personal decision, the one she had just named from memory. She said, "Why didn't you?" Not a question, an observation. The flat, precise language. I said, "Because it was right." She said, "It is right." Then her hand came to the drawing. Over mine, not replacing mine. Her hand over my hand on the paper. Both hands on the east elevation fenestration, the paper cool and faintly textured beneath my palm, and her palm warm above it. The weight of her hand was specific and deliberate, the same quality as every contact with the site model. Not accidental, not incidental. Her forearm was alongside mine at the drawing wall, the silk of her bralettes edge at her inner wrist where our arms made contact, warm in a way I had not expected, and then warming further. I was looking at the drawing. She was looking at the drawing. Both of us had our hands on the same architectural decision, which was right and which neither of us was changing. The room was quiet, the climate system, the city, my own breath, which was doing something she could probably hear. I thought, she has been reading my work for 11 months with the attention other people bring to things that matter to them, and she has touched the structural spine of my current project 12 times without asking. And she has her hand over my hand on the decision I was most afraid to make, and she has told me it is right. I thought, I stayed at my desk for 3 hours after the review signing and told myself it was because I had work and the work was sitting on my desk right now untouched. I thought, I am 34 years old and I have been in this firm for 11 years, and I am not going to pretend I don't know what this is. Her hand did not move. Mine didn't either. She said, without turning, "You've been here for 11 years. I said, "Yes," she said. "I've been here for 11 months. I said, "I'm aware," she said. "You answered my questions in February, all 3 of them, precisely, without giving me anything you didn't intend to give." I said, "That was the plan." A pause, her hand still over mine and the paper cool beneath both of us. She said, "It didn't work." I said, "No." The sound of that in the empty room was a statement about 11 months that neither of us had made in any formal document. It landed somewhere below my sternum and stayed. She said, "The restructure is signed." I said, "I know." She said, "Your role in the new structure is defined." I said, "I read the document." She said, "The document doesn't cover everything." I didn't say anything. She knew it was assent. Her hand lifted from mine. The absence of it against my hand was an event. The specific location, the back of my hand, the paper's surface now fully exposed, went alert in the particular way of skin that has been in contact with something it wanted and has now registered the removal. I kept my hand on the drawing. I did not move it. She stepped back from the wall. I heard her behind me, one step, the particular sound of her shoes on the office floor, which I had memorized across 11 months of her walking into and out of my office without realizing I was memorizing it. The site model was on the credenza to my left. I heard her hand on it, the faint sound of her palm against the basewood spine, and the particular silence of her not speaking. I turned from the wall. She was standing at the credenza, both hands at the credenza's edge. The desk lamp across the room was the only light, and it caught the dark silk of her nursing bralette across the distance. And her blazer was on the chair where she had put it when she came back at 10:04, and her hair was down, and she was looking at me. I crossed the office. I stopped at the credenza. The site model was between us, the structural spine, the upper-level transition zone, the revised foundation, 12 months of decisions all held in balsa and basswood at 1 to 200 scale. The city was through the window wall behind me. The lamp was behind her, and its warmth was on my face, and the ambient dark city light was on my back. And between the 2 light sources was 11 months of everything that was not in any document. She said, "Tell me what you've been not saying for 11 months. I looked at her across the site model. She said, "All of it. There is a specific quality of silence that precedes a sentence that cannot be taken back. It has a duration and a texture. This one lasted approximately 3 seconds and had the texture of something structural giving way. Not collapsing, not failing, but reaching the load limit and choosing to yield." I said, "You read my work before you arrived. You knew the coastal building's foundation compromise before I told you. You listened to me answer your questions in February, and you looked at my collarbone for 2 seconds in month 4, and I have not forgotten it. You have touched the structural spine of this model at every visit to my office. And you have never asked, and I have never told you to stop, and we both know why. You left your pen on my desk 3 times. I kept it each time until you came back for it, and I told myself that was because it wasn't mine. And that was also not the real reason. The document is signed, the review is complete, the year is over. And you came back at 10:04 p.m. and I was still here. That is everything I have been not saying. That is the complete version. Lena's exhale was audible. Not a controlled, professional breath. Not the kind she used in meetings. Not the kind she had used throughout 11 months of carefully managed professional proximity. The kind that comes from a chest that has been holding something at a specific pressure for a long time and has just heard the thing it came back at 10:04 p.m. to hear. It was a small sound, and it was the least controlled thing she had done in my presence, and it arrived in the space between us like a change in atmospheric pressure. Her hands moved from the credenza. She did not move quickly. She moved with the deliberateness she brought to everything. The same deliberateness as the hand on the structural spine of the model, as the pen left on the desk, as the 2 seconds in month 4. She brought both hands to my face, one palm at each cheek, her thumbs at my cheekbones, 2 points of pressure, steady, specific, not soft, but not demanding. The exact temperature of hands that have been in a room for an hour and are warm against skin that has been flushed since approximately 9 p.m. She held my face the way she held the site model, with the attention of someone who has been reading this for 11 months and has just confirmed what it is. I raised my hands and covered hers with mine. That was the complete version of staying. I had stayed at the desk for 3 hours, and I was staying now, my hands over her hands, and neither of us moved for a moment that had no business duration and was entirely outside the review document and the restructure and the formal record of the year. Her thumbs moved. A small adjustment, not pulling, not pressing, simply acknowledging the location. The warmth of them against my cheekbones was specific and continuous, and the lamp's warmth was on my face from across the room, and the city's ambient light was on my back from the window wall, and between the two I was held in something that was the year, and also the room, and also her hands on my face, and mine on hers. She said quietly, "The fenestration pattern." I said, "Yes." She said, "I've been thinking about it since month 3. I said, "So have I." She said, "It was right." I said, "I know." Her forehead came to mine. The contact was the distance between 11 months of formal correctness and where we were standing at 10:35 p.m. in a room surrounded by my work with her hands on my face. And it crossed that distance without announcement, forehead to forehead. And the warmth of it was immediate and specific, and I closed my eyes for the first time since she walked back through the door. Her breath was warm against my mouth, not closing, not yet. The particular quality of almost, the moment before, which she held for long enough that my whole nervous system had reorganized itself around the single point of her forehead against mine, and her breath in the space between our mouths and her thumbs at my cheekbones not moving. I said her name. She said, "I know." Then she kissed me, deliberately, the way she did everything, with the total attention of someone who has been considering this for 11 months and is now confirming what they knew. Her hands stayed at my face. Mine stayed over hers. The site model was on the credenza behind her. The Coastal Civic Building was on the wall. The desk lamp was the only light, and the city was through the window, and the floor was empty and had been empty since 9:50 p.m., and neither of us was leaving. At some point I was aware of the chair against the back of my knees, the desk chair, turned outward where I had left it when I stood up. And then I was sitting in it, and she was on the desk's edge beside me, and the review document was between us on the desk, signed and complete, and both of us were facing the Coastal Civic Building on the south wall, and the room was quiet in a way that was entirely different from the quiet at 9:50 p.m. She picked up her pen from the desk, the one she had left here 3 times. She held it for a moment, then she put it in her pocket. I looked at the site model on the credenza, at the structural spine, the upper-level transition zone, the foundation revision of month 9. Then I looked at the Coastal Civic Building on the wall. 11 years in this firm in large format print, surrounding the desk where I had just said everything I had been not saying, and the managing partner was on the desk's edge beside me with her shoulder against mine and her pen in her pocket. She said, "The residential project." I said, "Yes." She said, "The transition zone." I said, "What about it?" She said, "I want to see the original version, the one before the month 9 revision." I said, "Why?" She said, Because I want to understand the decision in both directions, not just where you ended up. I looked at her. She said, "Tomorrow, bring both versions." Her shoulder was against mine. The lamp was still warm. The city was doing what the city does, which is move, regardless of what has been resolved in the rooms above it. I said, "The building starts at 7:30. She said, "I know when the building starts." I said, "I'm usually at my desk by 8. She said, "I know." The room held that: the Coastal Civic Building on the wall, the site model on the credenza, the review document between us on the desk, signed and complete. The year officially over, the thing that was not in any document very much present in the room. She stayed another 20 minutes. We talked about the residential project, the actual project, the real technical decisions, the transition zone in both versions, the logic of the month 9 revision, and the conversation was the most unguarded I had had in 11 months, which was also the most professional in the sense of being genuinely about the work rather than about what it was appropriate to say about the work. She asked questions that required real answers. I gave them. My hand was on the desk and her hand was on the desk and our hands were not touching, which was a different kind of not touching than the previous 11 months. This one had a history. She left at 10:52 p.m. She said goodnight in a register that was almost the formal one and not quite. She put her blazer back on in the doorway. She walked down the dark corridor and I heard the elevator, and then the floor was quiet again. I sat at my desk. The site model, the Coastal Civic Building, the review document. Her pen gone from the desk for the first time in months because she had taken it with her. I turned off the desk lamp at 11:15 p.m. I stood at the window for a moment in the city's ambient light and looked at the Coastal Civic Building drawing in the dark. Visible still, the large format print, pale against the wall, the foundation compromise and the fenestration pattern, and every decision I had made across 3 years of that project, all there in the dark. Then I got my jacket from the chair and went home. In the morning I was at my desk by 8. The site model was in a different position from where I had left it. I noticed it immediately. The structural spine's orientation shifted approximately 15 degrees from where I position it after each working session, which is a specific position I have maintained since the model's first iteration. The shift was deliberate. Someone who knew the model well enough to touch it would not have moved it accidentally. There was a note on the model's base. Folded once, my name on the outside in handwriting I recognized, the formal, precise script from 11 months of documented correspondence. I unfolded it. The decision you wouldn't change. I know why. Breakfast. L. I read it twice. I set it on the desk beside the model. I looked at the Coastal Civic Building on the wall for a moment. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up both versions of the transition zone drawings, the original and the month 9 revision, and set them side by side on the screen. The technical differences between them were clear and documented. The reason for the revision was in the design logic, visible to anyone who understood the structural argument. She would see it when I showed her. She already knew it, most likely. She was asking to see it in both directions, which was a different thing from knowing it, which was the particular quality of her attention that had been costing me since February. I poured my coffee. It was still hot. Outside the window, the city was doing what the city does in the early morning, which is exist without opinion on anything that had happened in the rooms above it. The firm's floor was quiet. The early quiet before anyone else arrived, before the day's professional structure reasserted itself over whatever structure the night had established instead. The site model was in its slightly different position on the credenza. Her note was on my desk, the document was signed, the review was complete. The restructure would take effect in the new year, and my role in it was defined in writing and in a room at 10:35 p.m., and in a note on a site model's base, and in both versions of a transition zone drawing open on my screen. I heard the elevator at 7:48 a.m. The floor's quality of silence changed. I did not look up from the drawings. I could feel the change in the room's attention, the particular reorganization of atmospheric pressure that had been happening in rooms where she entered for 11 months, and I held my coffee and looked at the transition zone drawings and waited. Her footsteps in the corridor, the specific sound of them which I had memorized without meaning to, crossing the dark corridor toward the light of my office door. Stopping in the doorway, she said, "You found the note." I said, "It was on my model." She said, "You have both versions open." I said, "You said you wanted to see them." She came into the office. She did not go to the desk. She went to the credenza, The site model, her hand to the structural spine, the same position as every previous visit. She was in a different blazer from last night. Her hair was in the professional clip. The formal register was present and operational, and underneath it was last night, which was also present, and the room held both. She looked at the note on the desk beside the model. Then she looked at me. She said, "Breakfast." I said, "The building starts at 7:30. She said, "The building started at 7:30. It is now 7:52. I said, "So it did." She was looking at me with the total attention she had always brought to everything in this building. And this morning it was not divided between the formal register and something underneath it. Both were present, and neither was in conflict with the other, which was the difference between this morning and every morning for the previous 11 months. I saved the drawings, I closed the laptop, I stood up. The site model was between us on the credenza, and she had her hand on the structural spine, and I reached across and put my hand over hers for the first time, my palm warm over her hand on the cold basswood spine, and I felt her hand go still in the way it goes still when something arrives that she did not schedule. I said, "I know why the decision was right." She said, "Tell me over breakfast." I said, "All of it?" She said, "Start anywhere.